Hi, I'm Victoria. I walked into the Riverside Bistro carrying a portfolio of my latest design work, ready to celebrate what I thought would be a proud family moment. Instead, my mother looked me dead in the eye over her Caesar salad and said, "Honestly, I wish you were never here." The entire table erupted in laughter. Wine glasses clinked. My brother doubled over. His wife wiped tears from her eyes. But I didn't laugh. I stood there, frozen, feeling something inside me crack wide open. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a single envelope, and placed it on the white tablecloth. My mother's face went pale. Because what I had in that envelope would change everything she thought she knew about our family, about me, and about the fortune she'd been planning to control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in my small studio apartment in the Pearl District, surrounded by half-finished sketches and coffee mugs I'd forgotten to wash. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Family lunch Sunday. Mom insists. Don't flake." That was it. No warmth, no question about how I was doing, just a command dressed up as an invitation. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond at all. Our family gatherings had become something I endured rather than enjoyed, but some stubborn part of me kept showing up, kept hoping that maybe this time would be different. The Riverside Bistro sat along the Willamette River with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the gray October sky. I arrived exactly on time, which in my family meant I was already failing because Brandon and Vanessa were always fashionably late, and my mother treated punctuality as a sign of having nothing better to do. The hostess led me to a corner table where Aunt Patricia was already seated, scrolling through her phone with the kind of bored expression she wore like expensive jewelry. She glanced up, offered a thin smile, and returned to her screen without a word. I slid into the booth, smoothing down the dress I'd chosen carefully, a navy wrap dress that was professional enough to seem put together but not so formal that it would invite comments about me trying too hard. My mother arrived like weather, sweeping in with Brandon and Vanessa trailing behind her. Diane Hayes had the kind of beauty that required constant maintenance and vigilance, blonde hair that defied her age, nails that never chipped, clothes that whispered expensive even when she wasn't trying. She kissed the air near my cheek, leaving a cloud of perfume that made my eyes water, and settled into her seat with the grace of someone who knew every eye in the restaurant had tracked her entrance. Brandon clapped me on the shoulder like I was a buddy from his gym, and Vanessa gave me the kind of hug that involved no actual body contact, just a performance of affection for anyone watching. The server appeared, young and eager, and my mother ordered for the table without asking what anyone wanted. Champagne arrived first, expensive bubbles that my mother insisted we needed because Brandon had just closed another major development deal. I watched as she toasted him, her eyes shining with pride that I'd never seen directed at me. She talked about his achievements like they were her own, listing off property values and profit margins while Brandon leaned back in his chair, accepting the praise as though it were oxygen he needed to survive. Vanessa played her role perfectly, squeezing his arm, laughing at the right moments, adding little comments about how hard he worked and how brilliant he was at reading market trends. I sipped my champagne and tried to find space in the conversation to mention that I'd just landed a major client, a tech startup that wanted me to redesign their entire brand identity. It was the kind of project that could transform my freelance business into something sustainable, something real. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, someone else jumped in. Aunt Patricia wanted to talk about her trip to Napa. Vanessa needed everyone to know about the private yoga instructor she'd hired. My mother kept circling back to Brandon, to his success, to the empire he was building. I felt myself shrinking in my seat, becoming smaller and quieter until I wondered if I'd disappeared entirely. Then the food arrived, and with it, the moment that would fracture everything. My mother was talking about a charity gala she was planning, something to do with children's education, though I suspected it was more about her being photographed in an evening gown than actually helping anyone. She turned to me suddenly, as if remembering I existed, and asked what I'd been up to. The question felt like a trap, but I stepped into it anyway. I told her about the client, about the contract I'd signed, about how this could be the beginning of something significant for my career. I spoke quickly, trying to fit everything into the narrow window of attention she was offering. She listened with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, nodding in a way that felt mechanical. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then she set down her fork, dabbed her mouth with her napkin, and said, "That's nice, dear. Though I do wonder sometimes what your life would look like if you'd chosen something more stable. Your father always worried about you, you know. He used to say that some people are just built for struggle." The words landed like stones. I felt my face flush, my throat tighten. Before I could respond, Brandon jumped in with a laugh. "Come on, Mom, Tori's doing fine. Not everyone needs to be a mogul. Someone's got to make the flyers and posters, right?" Vanessa giggled into her wine glass. Aunt Patricia smirked. And my mother, my own mother, looked at me with something that resembled pity mixed with disappointment. "I just think," she continued, her voice taking on that tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel, "that maybe if we'd been more honest with you early on about your limitations, you wouldn't have wasted so much time chasing things that were never really meant for you." The table went still for half a second, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Honestly, I wish you were never here." The laughter started immediately. Brandon threw his head back, Vanessa clutched her stomach, and Patricia covered her mouth but her shoulders shook. Even the server, passing by with a tray of drinks, caught the tail end and smiled uncertainly. My mother sipped her champagne, looking satisfied, as if she'd just delivered the punchline to a joke everyone had been waiting for. But I didn't laugh. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was clarity, cold and sharp, cutting through years of excuses I'd made for her, for all of them. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal, the kind of thing that demanded attention. I placed it on the table between the breadbasket and my mother's half-eaten salad. The laughter died. My mother's eyes fixed on the envelope like it was a snake coiled to strike. "What's that?" she asked, her voice losing its casual cruelty and taking on an edge of suspicion. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of that envelope fill the space where her laughter had been. Then I stood, picked up my purse, and said quietly, "That's a letter from Grandfather Gerald. He wanted me to give it to you today. He said you'd understand what it means." My mother's face drained of color. Brandon leaned forward, suddenly interested. Vanessa's smile faltered. I turned and walked out of that restaurant with my head high, my heart pounding, and the absolute certainty that I'd just lit a fuse I couldn't extinguish. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice rise, sharp and demanding, calling my name. But I didn't look back. I pushed through the glass doors and into the October air, breathing deeply for the first time in hours. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my car. Text after text, call after call. I ignored all of them. Because what my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandfather Gerald had been planning this moment for months. And I was just getting started. Grandfather Gerald lived in a modest ranch house in Beaverton, a place that smelled like pine wood and old books. He was my father's father, a man who'd built a successful architecture firm from nothing and retired with enough money to live comfortably but not ostentatiously. My father had died when I was 16, a sudden heart attack that ripped our family apart in ways we never fully acknowledged. In the years since, my mother had remarried briefly, divorced, and dedicated herself to the religion of social status and material success. She'd always kept Gerald at arm's length, visiting only when it served her purposes, usually around holidays when she wanted to maintain the appearance of family unity. But Gerald had always been different with me. After my father died, he started calling me every Sunday. Not to talk about anything important, just to check in, to hear my voice, to remind me that someone remembered I existed. When I started my design business, he was the one who helped me buy my first computer, who insisted I take a business class, who reviewed my contracts like they were blueprints. He never made a big deal out of it, never asked for credit or gratitude. He just showed up, consistently and quietly, in a way that made me feel anchored when everything else felt like it was floating away. 2 months before that disastrous lunch, Gerald had called me and asked if I could come visit. There was something in his voice, a seriousness that made me drop everything and drive out to Beaverton that same afternoon. I found him in his study, surrounded by file boxes and legal documents spread across his massive oak desk. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He gestured for me to sit, poured us both tea from a ceramic pot he'd owned since before I was born, and said, "Victoria, I need to tell you some things about your father, about our family, and about what your mother has been doing since he died." What he told me over the next 3 hours rewrote everything I thought I understood about my family. My father had inherited a significant portion of Gerald's business when he died, properties and investments that were supposed to be held in trust for me and Brandon until we turned 30. But my mother, as executor of my father's estate, had been slowly draining those accounts, using legal loopholes and her charm to convince financial advisors that she was acting in our best interest. Brandon knew about some of it because she'd been funneling money into his development projects, essentially letting him build his empire on what should have been shared family wealth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I'd been kept completely in the dark, never mentioned in any of the transactions, systematically erased from the financial picture while being told I was the irresponsible one, the struggling artist who couldn't get her life together. Gerald had discovered all of this 6 months earlier when he'd requested an audit of the trust accounts. What he found enraged him, not just because of the financial theft, but because of the deliberate cruelty of cutting me out while pretending it was for my own good. He'd spent the last few months working with his attorney, Mr. Leonard Frost, to build a case that would not only expose what my mother had done but restore what was rightfully mine. The envelope I'd placed on the table wasn't just a letter. It was a legal notice that Gerald had revoked my mother's access to any remaining trust funds, had named me as the primary beneficiary of his own considerable estate, and had filed formal complaints with the financial institutions that had allowed the misappropriation to happen. But here's what my mother didn't know, what made that envelope so dangerous to her carefully constructed world. The trust my father had left included ownership stakes in 3 restaurant locations called Three Peaks Cafe, profitable businesses that generated steady income and had appreciated significantly in value. My mother had been collecting the dividends for years, telling Brandon they were returns on her own investments. She'd used that money to fund her lifestyle, her trips, her designer wardrobe. And now, with one legal filing, Gerald had transferred full ownership of those businesses to me. Not shared with Brandon. Not managed by my mother. Mine, completely and irrevocably. I spent the evening after the lunch at Gerald's house, watching my phone explode with increasingly frantic messages. My mother demanded I call her immediately. Brandon sent a series of texts that started angry and ended threatening. Vanessa left a voicemail saying I was being dramatic and needed to apologize. Aunt Patricia texted that I'd embarrassed the family and should be ashamed. I read each message with Gerald sitting beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, his presence a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. "They're scared," he said simply. "People who've built their lives on lies always are when the truth starts surfacing." Mr. Frost arrived around 7, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived several decades of courtroom battles. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from having seen every variation of family drama imaginable. He laid out the documents on Gerald's dining room table, explaining each one in detail. The trust records showing the systematic withdrawals. The forged authorizations my mother had used to access accounts that should have been locked. The business valuations proving that Three Peaks Cafe was worth substantially more than my mother had ever disclosed. The timeline showing that these actions had begun within months of my father's death, when I was still grieving and vulnerable and had no idea what questions to ask. But the most damaging evidence was something I hadn't expected. Gerald had hired a private investigator 3 months earlier, and what they'd uncovered went beyond financial fraud. The investigator had found emails between my mother and Brandon, conversations where they explicitly discussed keeping me ignorant of the trust, where my mother referred to me as the liability, and Brandon joked about how easy it was to manipulate someone who was too emotional to handle money. There were text messages where Vanessa had suggested they could contest any future claims I might make by painting me as unstable, unreliable, someone whose artistic temperament made her unfit to manage finances. They'd built an entire narrative about who I was, a story designed to justify erasing me from my own inheritance. I sat at Gerald's dining table staring at printed emails that contained words I never imagined my own family would use to describe me. The investigator had compiled everything into a bound report, pages and pages of documentation that painted a picture of calculated cruelty spanning over a decade. There were bank statements showing regular transfers from the trust accounts into my mother's personal checking, always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic reviews. There were property records revealing that the Cannon Beach house, the vacation home my mother claimed she'd purchased with her own savings, had actually been bought using funds from my father's estate. Brandon's first major development deal, the one that launched his career and earned him local recognition, had been financed almost entirely with money that should have been split between us. Gerald poured himself a glass of scotch and offered me one. I normally didn't drink hard liquor, but tonight felt like an exception. The amber liquid burned going down, and somehow that physical sensation grounded me, reminded me I was real and present in this moment even though part of me felt like I was watching everything happen to someone else. Mr. Frost continued walking me through the legal strategy, his voice steady and professional, but I could see anger flickering behind his eyes. He'd known my father, had drafted the original trust documents with explicit instructions about how the assets should be protected and distributed. Watching those instructions be violated so flagrantly had offended his sense of justice in a way that went beyond professional obligation. The plan was methodical. First, we'd file formal complaints with the financial institutions, forcing them to freeze any remaining trust accounts and conduct their own investigations. Second, we'd serve my mother and Brandon with notice of legal action, demanding full accounting of every transaction going back to my father's death. Third, and this was the part that made my stomach clench with nervous anticipation, we'd request a family meeting with a mediator present, giving them one chance to settle this privately before everything became public record. Mr. Frost believed my mother would fight initially, would bluster and threaten, but eventually she'd recognize that going to court would expose her to criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Brandon would likely cave faster because he had more to lose, a public reputation built on being a successful entrepreneur rather than someone who'd climbed on the back of stolen family money. But I had questions that went beyond legal strategy. I looked at Gerald, this man who'd quietly watched his son's widow dismantle everything his son had tried to build, and asked why he'd waited so long. Why hadn't he intervened years ago when the theft was first happening? Gerald set down his glass and was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table. Because I didn't know, he finally said, his voice heavy with regret. Your mother was careful. She maintained appearances, brought you and Brandon to visit on holidays, sent photos and updates that made everything look normal. I trusted her because my son had trusted her, and I didn't want to believe that someone he'd loved could be capable of this. By the time I started asking questions, started noticing discrepancies, years had already passed. I failed you, Victoria. I failed my son. I reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was thin and spotted with age, but his grip was still strong. You're here now, I said softly. That's what matters. We sat like that for a while, the weight of lost years hanging between us but also the tentative hope that maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. Mr. Frost excused himself to make some phone calls, leaving Gerald and me alone in the dining room. The house settled around us with small creaks and sighs, familiar sounds that reminded me of visiting here as a child, when my father was still alive and the world felt simpler. Gerald pulled out a photo album I hadn't seen before, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside were pictures of my father as a young man, before I was born, working on construction sites during summer breaks from college. Gerald pointed to one photo showing my dad covered in sawdust, grinning at the camera with his arms around two other workers. He loved building things, Gerald said. Not just structures, but relationships, community, legacy. He wanted you and Brandon to have security, yes, but more than that he wanted you to have purpose. He believed that real wealth wasn't about accumulating money but about creating something that mattered, something that would outlast him. I studied my father's young face in the photograph, searching for traces of myself in his features. I had his eyes, the same hazel color that shifted between green and brown depending on the light. I had his stubborn chin and his tendency to bite my lower lip when concentrating. But more than physical traits, I wondered if I'd inherited his values, his sense of what mattered. My mother had spent years telling me I was impractical, that my choice to pursue art and design was naive and self-indulgent. But looking at this photo of my father building something with his own hands, I realized that creating things was in my blood, that there was honor in making beauty and meaning even if it didn't always translate to impressive bank statements. Gerald turned the pages slowly, narrating memories of my father's childhood, his struggles and triumphs, the values he'd tried to instill. There was a photo of my parents' wedding, my mother young and radiant in white lace, my father looking at her like she was the only person in the world. It hurt to see that image knowing what she'd become, or maybe knowing what she'd always been beneath the performance of love. Had my father seen hints of her capacity for cruelty, or had she hidden it well enough that he died never knowing the truth about the woman he'd married? I'd never know, and that uncertainty felt like another kind of loss. Mr. Frost returned with news that he'd filed the initial paperwork electronically, which meant my mother would receive formal notification within the next 24 hours. Once she gets that notice, he explained, she'll likely contact her own attorney. Expect aggressive pushback initially. She'll claim everything she did was legal, that she had authority as executor, that you're being vindictive and ungrateful. Don't engage directly with her. Let me handle all communication. Anything you say to her right now can be used to paint you as unstable or manipulative, and we can't give her ammunition. I nodded, understanding the strategy even though part of me wanted to call my mother right then and unleash years of suppressed anger and hurt. That night I stayed in Gerald's guest room, the same room I'd slept in during visits as a child. The wallpaper was still the same faded floral pattern, the quilt on the bed still the one Gerald's late wife had made by hand decades ago. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through scenarios of how the next days and weeks would unfold. I thought about Brandon, about whether he'd understood the full scope of what our mother had done or if he'd convinced himself it was justified somehow. I thought about Vanessa, who'd married into this family and enthusiastically participated in my marginalization without ever questioning whether it was right. I thought about Aunt Patricia, who'd watched it all happen and said nothing because maintaining family harmony mattered more than defending someone who had no power. But mostly I thought about my father, about the man in those photographs who'd worked so hard to build security for his children, only to have his wishes ignored and his legacy plundered. I made a promise to him that night, silently, to his memory and to the values he'd tried to pass down. I promised I'd see this through, not because I cared about the money itself, but because the truth mattered, justice mattered, and someone needed to stand up and say that what had been done was wrong. I fell asleep sometime after midnight, exhausted but strangely peaceful, knowing that the hardest parts were still ahead but also knowing I was finally fighting back. Morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Portland October weather that matched my mood. I drove back to my apartment in the Pearl District, navigating familiar streets while my phone continued its relentless buzzing. I'd turned off notifications but could still see the screen lighting up repeatedly, message after message demanding my attention. At a red light, I glanced at the most recent text from Brandon. "You're making a huge mistake. Call me before you do something you'll regret." The light changed and I drove on, letting his threat hang unanswered in digital space. My apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller somehow, as if the events of the past 24 hours had expanded my perspective and now this space that had felt like home seemed cramped and temporary. I made coffee and sat by the window watching rain streak down the glass, feeling oddly calm despite everything. My best friend Kayla called around 9, her voice breathless with concern. She'd been at the restaurant yesterday, seated several tables away, and had witnessed the entire scene. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing," she said. "I wanted to come over and say something, but you left so fast. Are you okay? What was in that envelope?" I told her everything. The trust fund theft, Gerald's investigation, the legal action we'd filed. Kayla listened without interrupting, and when I finished there was a long pause before she spoke. "Tori, I've watched your family treat you like you don't matter for years. I've bitten my tongue so many times because you asked me to, because you said they were still your family and you had to try to make it work. But what your mom said yesterday, that wasn't just mean. That was cruel on a level that's unforgivable. Whatever happens next, whatever you need, I'm here. Witnesses, testimonies, someone to sit with you during depositions, whatever. Her support steadied something inside me that had been wobbling, reminded me that family wasn't just about blood but about who showed up when things got hard. The formal legal notice was delivered to my mother's house at 2 in the afternoon. I know because Mr. Frost called to confirm it had been signed for. Now we wait, he said. She'll need time to consult with her attorney, review the documentation, and decide how to respond. Don't be surprised if she tries to contact you directly, possibly with apologies or explanations designed to manipulate you into dropping this. Remember, anything she says is strategy, not genuine remorse. I assured him I understood, but part of me still hoped irrationally that maybe seeing the evidence would shock my mother into recognizing what she'd done, into feeling some shred of guilt or accountability. That hope lasted approximately 3 hours. At 5:15 my apartment buzzer rang insistently, someone leaning on it without pause. I checked the video intercom and saw my mother standing in the rain, her hair plastered to her head, mascara running down her cheeks. She looked directly into the camera. "Victoria, let me in. We need to talk about this ridiculous situation. You're being manipulated by a bitter old man who never accepted me. Please, I'm your mother. Let me explain." Her voice cracked with emotion, but I'd seen her perform before, knew how easily she could summon tears when they served her purpose. I didn't buzz her in. Instead I called Mr. Frost, who advised me to document her presence, take photos or video, but not engage. If she won't leave, call the police for trespassing. Do not open that door. I watched through the intercom as my mother buzzed again and again, then started pounding on the exterior door, shouting my name. Other residents began appearing in the lobby, concerned or annoyed by the disturbance. Finally the building manager approached her, and I could see their conversation though I couldn't hear it. My mother gestured wildly, pointing at the intercom, but the manager shook his head firmly. After several more minutes of arguing, she finally left, stumbling out into the rain with her shoulders shaking. I should have felt victorious watching her retreat. Instead I felt hollow, sad in a way that had nothing to do with the legal battle and everything to do with the reality that the woman who gave birth to me would rather manipulate and deceive than simply admit wrongdoing and apologize. That night I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "From your mother, please read." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was long, rambling, full of justifications and reframing. She claimed everything she'd done was to protect me from myself, that I'd been too fragile after my father's death to handle financial responsibility. She said Brandon had needed the investment capital to succeed, and his success benefited the whole family. She insisted the Cannon Beach house was essentially mine too because I was always welcome to visit, so really she hadn't taken anything that wasn't meant to be shared. But the final paragraph revealed her true strategy. "If you proceed with this vindictive legal action, you'll destroy our family forever. Brandon will never forgive you. Vanessa is already talking about cutting ties completely. Aunt Patricia thinks you've lost your mind. You'll be alone, Victoria, with nothing but money you didn't earn and the knowledge that you tore apart the only family you have. Is that really what you want? Is that what your father would have wanted? I'm begging you, call off your grandfather's attack dogs and let's resolve this as a family. I love you, even if you can't see that right now. Mom." I read the email 3 times, analyzing each sentence for the manipulation techniques Mr. Frost had warned me about. The gaslighting, suggesting I was fragile and irrational. The financial minimizing, pretending her theft was really just family resource sharing. The emotional blackmail, threatening isolation and invoking my dead father's wishes. The false olive branch, offering family resolution while taking no responsibility for her actions. It was a masterclass in narcissistic damage control, and it made me angrier than anything else she'd done because it showed she still believed I was stupid enough to fall for it. I forwarded the email to Mr. Frost without responding to my mother. He replied within minutes. "Perfect. She's creating a written record of admitting to the financial actions while trying to justify them. This actually strengthens our case. Do not reply. If she continues contacting you, we can pursue a restraining order." I sat with that information, realizing that my mother's desperation was working against her, that every attempt to manipulate me into backing down was actually building the evidence file that would ensure her defeat. There was irony in that, justice of a sort, watching her destroy herself with the same tactics she'd used to control me for years. The next morning I met with Gerald and Mr. Frost at a small cafe near the courthouse. We needed to prepare for the possibility that my mother would refuse to settle, that this would go to formal litigation and eventually trial. Mr. Frost walked me through what that process would look like, the depositions and discovery, the months of legal maneuvering, the eventual courtroom testimony where I'd have to face my mother and brother and recite for a judge and jury all the ways they'd betrayed me. It sounded exhausting and traumatic, but also strangely clarifying. For years I'd made myself small, swallowed my hurt, accepted crumbs of affection and called it family love. The idea of standing up in public and speaking truth felt terrifying but also liberating, like finally using my voice after decades of enforced silence. Gerald ordered us sandwiches we barely touched, the food sitting forgotten as we reviewed documents and strategy. He looked tired, older than he had just days before, and I realized this fight was taking a toll on him too. He'd lost his son years ago, and now he was losing the illusion that his son's family had remained intact and functional. "Do you regret starting this?" I asked him quietly when Mr. Frost stepped away to take a phone call. Gerald looked at me with fierce clarity. "The only thing I regret is not seeing it sooner, not protecting you when you needed it most. But regret doesn't fix anything. Action does. So no, I don't regret this. And I won't stop until you get back what's yours." Mr. Frost returned with news that my mother's attorney had made contact requesting a meeting. "They want to talk settlement," he said, unable to hide a small smile. "They're scared, which means they know how bad this looks. We'll meet, hear their offer, but we're not accepting anything less than full restitution plus damages for emotional harm. They don't get to steal from you for a decade and then buy their way out with a fraction of what they took." I felt a surge of gratitude for this man who transformed from a name in Gerald's contacts to a fierce advocate treating my case like it was the most important thing in his world. We scheduled the meeting for 2 days later, giving my mother's legal team time to prepare whatever defense they'd constructed. Those 48 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to work on client projects but couldn't focus, my mind constantly spinning through scenarios of what might happen. Kayla came over both nights, bringing takeout and staying late, her presence a reminder that I had people in my corner even if my blood relatives had abandoned me. She helped me practice what I'd say if the mediator asked me direct questions, role-playing different scenarios until I felt steadier, more prepared. The morning of the meeting I dressed carefully in clothes that projected confidence and competence, a charcoal gray suit that Kayla had helped me pick out, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. I wanted to look nothing like the struggling artist my mother had always dismissed, wanted to embody the successful professional I was becoming despite her interference. Gerald met me outside the mediator's office building downtown, and we rode the elevator in silence, both of us preparing mentally for confrontation. The conference room was aggressively neutral, beige walls and a long table with uncomfortable chairs designed to encourage quick resolution. My mother sat on one side with Brandon and a lawyer I didn't recognize, a severe woman in her 50s who radiated expensive legal education. Vanessa wasn't present, which I found interesting and slightly relieving. The mediator, a patient-looking man with kind eyes, explained the ground rules for discussion. Everyone would have chances to speak, no interruptions, focus on finding resolution rather than assigning blame. It all sounded very civilized and reasonable, completely at odds with the rage and betrayal simmering beneath the surface. My mother spoke first. Her voice was controlled, sad, the voice of a woman who'd been gravely misunderstood. She talked about how difficult it had been raising 2 children after my father's death, managing finances she'd never expected to handle alone, making hard choices about how to allocate limited resources. She claimed that every decision had been made with our best interests at heart, that she'd prioritize Brandon's business investments because they would generate returns that would eventually benefit both of us. She described the Cannon Beach house as a family asset where I'd always been welcome, conveniently ignoring that she'd used trust funds meant for me to purchase it without my knowledge. She painted herself as a devoted mother doing her imperfect best in impossible circumstances. Brandon backed her up, his voice earnest and slightly condescending. He explained that he'd assumed all the financial arrangements were legal and proper, that he'd trusted our mother's judgment, that he'd never intended to take anything that wasn't his. He suggested that the real problem was Gerald poisoning my mind against them, turning normal family financial management into something sinister. He looked directly at me when he said, "Tori, you know I love you. This doesn't have to destroy our relationship. We can work this out if you just talk to us directly instead of hiding behind lawyers and a grandfather who's never liked Mom." I listened to Brandon's performance without changing expression, making mental notes of every deflection and false appeal to sibling loyalty. When he finished, the mediator turned to me and asked if I wanted to respond. I glanced at Mr. Frost, who gave a slight nod. Then I opened the folder in front of me and began speaking in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness. I didn't start with accusations or anger. Instead, I laid out facts, dates, account numbers, transaction amounts. I described receiving no information about the trust until Gerald's investigation revealed it existed. I explained that while Brandon was building his real estate empire with family money, I'd been working 3 freelance jobs simultaneously just to cover rent, often skipping meals to afford art supplies because I believed I had no safety net. I produced copies of the emails the investigator had uncovered, sliding them across the table. My mother's face went rigid as she recognized her own words calling me a liability. Brandon's confident expression faltered when he saw his jokes about my emotional instability preserved in black and white. Their attorney picked up the documents, scanning quickly, and I watched her professional mask slip for just a moment as she realized how damaging this evidence was. I continued methodically, pulling out bank statements showing my mother's regular withdrawals, property records for the Cannon Beach house, financial projections demonstrating that if the trust had been managed properly I should have received substantial distributions years ago. Then I addressed my mother directly, my voice dropping lower but gaining intensity. "You stood in front of a restaurant full of people 2 weeks ago and said you wished I was never here. Everyone laughed because you've spent years training them to see me as a joke, as someone whose feelings and dreams don't matter. But here's what you didn't know when you said that. Dad left me half of everything. Not because I earned it, but because he loved me and wanted me to have security and opportunity. You stole that. Not accidentally, not through mismanagement, but deliberately and systematically. You erased me from my own inheritance while telling me I was irresponsible and impractical. You gaslit me into believing I was the problem while you were robbing me blind." The room went completely silent. My mother opened her mouth but no sound came out. Brandon stared at the table. Their attorney cleared her throat and asked for a brief recess to consult with her clients privately. The mediator agreed, and Gerald, Mr. Frost and I stepped out into the hallway. My hands were shaking now that the adrenaline of confrontation was fading, but Gerald squeezed my shoulder with quiet pride. "Your father would be proud of how you handled that," he said softly. Mr. Frost was more pragmatic, already strategizing about what settlement terms we'd accept, what we'd reject, how to leverage their obvious discomfort into the best possible outcome. We waited 20 minutes before being called back in. My mother's face was blotchy, her carefully applied makeup smudged. Brandon looked smaller somehow, his usual swagger completely absent. Their attorney spoke in clipped professional tones, acknowledging that there had been some irregularities in the trust management, proposing a settlement that would return a portion of the misappropriated funds plus establish a payment plan for the remainder. The numbers she suggested were insulting, barely a third of what had been taken, spread over 10 years as if my mother was doing me a favor by eventually returning money that was already mine. Mr. Frost didn't even pretend to consider it. "That's not a settlement, that's an insult. Full restitution of all misappropriated funds, including appreciation those funds would have generated if properly invested. Transfer of the Cannon Beach property to Victoria's name. Public acknowledgement of the financial mismanagement. And punitive damages for emotional harm and deliberate concealment. Those are our minimum terms. If you can't agree to that today, we'll see you in court where criminal fraud charges will also be filed." The attorney tried to negotiate, suggesting modifications and compromises, but Mr. Frost shut down each attempt with calm finality. My mother finally spoke, her voice breaking. "How can you do this to your own family? I made mistakes, I admit that, but this vindictiveness, this cruelty, that's not who you are, Victoria. You're destroying us. I met her eyes across the table, seeing in them not remorse but fury that she'd been caught, anger that her control was slipping away. I'm not destroying anything, I said quietly. I'm exposing what was already broken. You destroyed this family the moment you decided your comfort and Brandon's success mattered more than basic honesty and fairness. That's on you, not me. Brandon tried a different tack, appealing to shared history and childhood memories, reminding me of times we'd been close as kids, asking if I really wanted to throw all that away over money. It was almost effective, tugging at that part of me that still wanted to believe family meant something, that blood created obligations that transcended harm. But then I remembered the emails, his laughter at the Riverside Bistro, the years of casual dismissal and contempt, and I realized those childhood memories he was invoking had happened before he'd learned to see me through our mother's eyes, before he'd been corrupted by greed and enabled cruelty. I don't want to throw anything away, I told him. But I also won't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. You made choices, Brandon. You knew where that investment money came from. Maybe you didn't ask too many questions because it was convenient not to know, but that doesn't make you innocent. You benefited from theft, and you participated in marginalizing me to protect your access to resources you knew weren't entirely yours. So don't talk to me about throwing things away when you've been discarding my dignity and rights for years. The mediation ended without resolution. My mother's attorney said they'd need time to consult with financial advisors and prepare a counter-offer, but Mr. Frost made it clear our terms weren't negotiable. As we gathered our documents to leave, my mother tried one last manipulation, reaching across the table to grab my hand. Please, Victoria. I know I wasn't perfect, but I'm still your mother. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked down at her manicured fingers clutching mine, rings I now recognized had probably been purchased with my money, and gently extracted my hand. It means I wish things were different, I said. But wishing doesn't change what you did. We left the building into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the artificial lighting of the conference room. Gerald suggested lunch, but I wasn't hungry, my stomach still churning with leftover adrenaline and emotion. We ended up at a small park along the river, sitting on a bench watching joggers and cyclists pass by, normal people living normal lives unaware of the family drama unfolding nearby. Mr. Frost reviewed his notes, already drafting the formal complaint we'd file if settlement negotiations failed. He estimated we had a 90% chance of winning in court, maybe higher given the documentary evidence, but warned the process could take a year or more if my mother fought every step. Are you prepared for that? He asked, looking at me seriously. A year of depositions, court dates, seeing your mother and brother regularly in adversarial settings, having your family history examined publicly. It takes a toll, even when you're in the right. I thought about it honestly, weighing the cost of prolonged litigation against the cost of accepting less than full justice. I'm prepared, I said finally. Because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about the principle that people can't abuse their positions of trust and get away with it just because they're family. If I back down now, I'm telling every person who's been financially exploited by relatives that they should just accept it to keep the peace. I won't do that. Gerald squeezed my hand, his eyes wet. Your father chose well when he chose your name. Victoria. Victory. He wanted you to be strong, to fight for what's right. He'd be so damn proud. We sat together as the sun began its descent, painting the river in shades of gold and amber, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for years. This was hard, maybe the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also right. I was finally standing up for myself in a way I'd been too afraid or too conditioned to do before. The next week brought a flurry of legal activity. My mother's attorney filed motions to dismiss, claiming the statute of limitations had expired on some of the financial claims. Mr. Frost countered with fraud exception arguments, pointing out that concealed theft doesn't start its limitation clock until the victim discovers the crime. Discovery demands went back and forth, each side requesting documents and communications. I spent hours with Mr. Frost preparing responses to interrogatories, legal questions that required detailed written answers under oath. Every question felt designed to trap or embarrass me, asking about my employment history, income, mental health treatment, substance use, anything they could potentially use to paint me as unreliable or vindictive. But I answered truthfully and thoroughly, with Mr. Frost's guidance, refusing to be ashamed of having seen a therapist after my father's death or having struggled financially as a freelance artist. Those things didn't make me incompetent or unworthy of my inheritance. If anything, they demonstrated that I'd survived difficult circumstances without the safety net I should have had, making my mother's theft even more cruel. We also prepared our own discovery requests, demanding every financial record my mother and Brandon had from the past 12 years, every email and text message mentioning me or the trust, every document related to Brandon's business ventures and their funding sources. The Cannon Beach house became a particular point of contention. My mother claimed it was her separate property, purchased with her own earnings and savings. But property records told a different story, showing the down payment had come from an account directly linked to my father's trust just weeks after his death, when my mother had first gained executor access. The timing was damning, suggesting she'd immediately started siphoning assets for personal use. Mr. Frost filed a motion to place a lien on the property pending resolution of the case, preventing my mother from selling or refinancing it to hide assets. Her attorney fought back viciously, but the judge granted our motion based on the documentary evidence connecting trust funds to the purchase. I stayed busy with client work, using design projects as a mental escape from the legal battle consuming so much of my energy. Kayla helped me organize my files and schedule, making sure I met deadlines and maintained professional standards even while dealing with personal chaos. She'd become more than a friend through this process, more like a sister in the truest sense, someone who showed up consistently without expecting anything in return. When I tried to thank her for everything she was doing, she waved it off. "You do the same for me." That's what actual family does. They support each other because they want to, not because they're obligated or because they're getting something out of it. One evening about 6 weeks into the legal process, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a spam call, but something made me pick up. Brandon's voice came through, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Tori, please don't hang up. I need to talk to you, just you, no lawyers or mediators. Can you meet me somewhere neutral? Just 30 minutes. I promise I'm not trying to trick you or change your mind about anything. I just need to say some things face to face." Every instinct told me to refuse, to maintain the boundaries Mr. Frost had advised, but curiosity won out. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in a busy shopping district, public enough that I'd feel safe but private enough that we could talk. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 untouched coffees in front of him. He looked terrible, shadows under his eyes, his usually perfect hair disheveled, wearing jeans and a hoodie instead of his typical expensive casual wear. I slid into the booth across from him, keeping my coat on, my body language closed and defensive. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Brandon pushed one of the coffees toward me, a latte with extra foam the way I'd always ordered them when we used to grab coffee together years ago, and that small remembered detail nearly broke through my armor. "I'm not here to ask you to drop the lawsuit," he started, his voice rough. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I'm here because I've spent the last month looking at all the evidence, really looking at it, and I've had to face some things about myself that I've been avoiding for a long time." He paused, staring into his coffee like it might contain answers. "I knew, Tori. Maybe not the full extent, maybe I didn't know every specific transaction, but I knew Mom was using trust money for my business. I knew it wasn't entirely her money to give. And I told myself it was fine because she was the executor, because she said it was legal, because believing her was easier than asking hard questions." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years, genuine emotion beneath the polished surface. "When we were kids, before Dad died, I actually liked you. You were my little sister and I looked out for you. But after he was gone, Mom started talking about how you were too sensitive, too impractical, how you needed to be managed and protected from yourself. And instead of questioning that, I just accepted it. It was easier to see you the way she did, easier to justify taking more than my share because I was the responsible one, the one who would use resources productively." His voice cracked slightly. "But that was bullshit. That was me letting Mom's toxicity corrupt what should have been unconditional sibling loyalty. I wanted to stay angry, to maintain the righteous fury that had sustained me through weeks of legal warfare. But sitting across from my brother, watching him struggle with accountability in a way our mother never had, I felt that anger soften into something more complicated, sadness mixed with cautious hope. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked quietly. He exhaled slowly, running his hands through his hair. "Because Vanessa left me. She said she didn't sign up to be married to someone who built his success on stolen money, that my reputation is damaged and she's not going down with me. And losing her, as much as that hurts, made me realize how shallow everything I've built really is. The business, the social status, the respect I thought I'd earned, it's all founded on taking what wasn't mine. I'm ashamed, Tori. Deeply, genuinely ashamed." I sipped the latte he'd ordered for me, buying time to process what he was saying, testing whether this was genuine contrition or another manipulation attempt. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. Brandon shook his head. "Nothing. I don't want you to drop the lawsuit. I don't want you to forgive me before you're ready. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I did, what I enabled, and I'm sorry. That's it. That's all I came to say." We talked for another hour, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. He asked about my design work and actually listened to my answers, showing interest that felt genuine rather than performative. I asked about his business and how it would survive if he had to return the trust money that had funded it. He admitted he'd probably have to sell some properties, scale back significantly, maybe even file for bankruptcy depending on how the settlement was structured. "But that's fair," he said with a bitter smile. "I should never have gotten this big this fast. It was artificial, built on advantages I didn't earn. If I have to start over with only what's actually mine, that's what I deserve." We parted awkwardly, not with a hug but with a handshake that felt like the beginning of something, maybe not full reconciliation but at least acknowledgement of reality and harm. I watched him walk to his car, shoulders slumped in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen him in years. I called Mr. Frost from my car to tell him about the meeting, and he listened carefully before advising that Brandon's apparent remorse was positive but shouldn't change our legal strategy. People's feelings shifted, but documented theft required documented consequences. 2 weeks later, my mother's attorney called requesting another settlement meeting. This time the tone was different, more subdued, less aggressive posturing. We met in the same conference room, but the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. My mother looked diminished somehow, older and less certain. Her attorney laid out a revised offer that came much closer to our demands: full restitution of documented trust withdrawals, transfer of the Cannon Beach house, and a formal written acknowledgement of financial mismanagement. The only significant difference from our demands was the punitive damages, which they still argued were excessive and unwarranted. Mr. Frost and I huddled in the hallway to discuss. He believed we could win the punitive damages in court, but it would extend the litigation another 6 to 9 months and the emotional cost might outweigh the financial benefit. "The choice is yours," he said. "We can accept this and be done, or we can fight for every dollar you're owed. Both options are valid." I thought about the past 2 months, the toll this had taken on my work, my sleep, my peace of mind. I thought about Brandon's apology and the possibility of eventual healing if the warfare ended. I thought about my father and what he would have wanted, not just financial justice but also the possibility of family restoration if real change occurred. "I'll accept it," I said finally. "But I want one addition to the written acknowledgement. I want her to state clearly that her comments about wishing I was never here were unjustified and hurtful, and that she acknowledges I had every right to the inheritance Dad intended for me." Mr. Frost smiled slightly, recognizing this was about more than money, it was about validation and dignity. He presented the addition to my mother's attorney, who consulted with my mother in whispered tones. I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions: resistance, calculation, resignation. Finally she nodded, and her attorney agreed to the term. We spent another 3 hours finalizing settlement language, making sure every detail was precisely documented and legally binding. By the end, I had a signed agreement guaranteeing me everything that should have been mine from the start, plus the written acknowledgement of wrongdoing that restored my dignity in a formal, permanent way. My mother signed the documents with shaking hands, refusing to meet my eyes. Brandon wasn't present for this meeting, but his attorney signed on his behalf, acknowledging his role in benefiting from the misappropriated funds and agreeing to cooperate with the repayment structure. As we prepared to leave, my mother stopped me at the door. "I do love you," she said quietly. "I know you don't believe that right now, maybe you'll never believe it, but it's true. I got twisted up in protecting my lifestyle, in living up to standards I'd set for myself, and I lost sight of what mattered. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that the person who said those things at the restaurant, that's not who I want to be." I looked at her carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the practiced emotion. "Then don't be that person," I said simply. "Actions matter more than words. Show me through how you live going forward, not through what you say in this hallway." She nodded, tears spilling over, and I left without looking back. The settlement funds transferred into my account 3 weeks later on a gray December morning. I watched the numbers appear on my banking app screen, a sum larger than anything I'd ever imagined having access to, and felt strangely numb. This wasn't lottery winnings or an unexpected windfall. This was restitution for years of theft, compensation for being systematically erased from my own family's financial narrative. The money represented loss as much as gain, time I couldn't get back, opportunities I'd missed because I'd been surviving instead of thriving. Gerald called within an hour of the transfer completing, his voice warm with satisfaction. "Justice takes time, but it comes," he said. "Your father would rest easier knowing this is finally right." We made plans to have dinner that weekend, just the two of us, a quiet celebration away from lawyers and courtrooms and the weight of litigation. But first I had other business to handle, decisions to make about what came next now that I had both resources and freedom I'd never possessed before. I started by paying off the student loans that had haunted me since art school, debt I'd been chipping away at for years with minimum payments that barely touched the principal. Watching that balance drop to zero felt more meaningful than receiving the settlement itself, like cutting an anchor that had been dragging behind me for a decade. Then I paid off my car, my credit cards, all the small accumulations of financial stress that came from living paycheck to paycheck as a freelance designer. Within a week of receiving the money, I'd eliminated every source of debt that had made me feel perpetually behind and anxious. Kayla helped me interview financial advisors, sitting through meetings where serious professionals in expensive suits tried to convince me to invest in various portfolios and strategies. I chose a woman named Patricia Chen who'd built her practice specifically around helping artists and creative professionals manage irregular income and plan for sustainable futures. She didn't judge my previous financial struggles or treat my design career as a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about my professional goals, my risk tolerance, my values around money and legacy, then created a plan that balanced security with continued investment in my business. The Cannon Beach house transferred to my name in mid-December, and I drove out to see it on a cold Saturday morning with wind whipping off the ocean. I hadn't been there in over 3 years, not since my mother had made it clear through subtle comments and scheduling conflicts that I wasn't really welcome unless it served her purposes. The house sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, a sprawling cedar structure with walls of windows facing the water. My father had loved the ocean, had talked about buying beach property someday where we could gather as a family and watch storms roll in. Walking through the empty rooms felt surreal, my footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. My mother had decorated in neutrals and whites, everything pristine and impersonal like a hotel rather than a home where memories were made. I stood in the main living room watching waves crash against rocks below and made a decision. I would keep the house, but I'd transform it completely, paint the walls in warm colors, fill it with comfortable furniture that invited actual living, open it up not just for myself but for other people who needed space to heal and create. Over the next month I worked with a local interior designer to reimagine the space. We added a large studio with north-facing light where I could work on design projects and personal art. We converted the formal dining room into a community space with a massive table that could seat 12, imagining dinners and gatherings for artist friends, chosen family, people who understood that home was built through presence rather than blood. We softened the austere master bedroom, added books and textiles and living things, made the space feel inhabited and loved. The transformation took weeks, but watching the house shed my mother's cold aesthetic and become something warmer felt like reclaiming not just property but possibility. My design business grew in ways I hadn't anticipated once I had capital to invest in better equipment, professional development, and marketing. I hired an assistant, a recent design school graduate named Marcus who brought fresh energy and technical skills that complemented my more intuitive creative approach. We moved into a proper studio space in a shared creative building, surrounding ourselves with other artists, photographers, and makers who understood the particular challenges and joys of building a creative career. My client roster expanded beyond local startups to include regional nonprofits and even a few national brands who'd found me through word of mouth and portfolio showcases. But success felt different than I'd imagined it would during all those years of struggle. The satisfaction came less from financial stability, though that mattered, and more from the freedom to choose projects that aligned with my values, to turn down work that felt soul-crushing or exploitative, to invest time in passion projects that might not pay immediately but fulfilled something deeper. I started a free design clinic one Saturday a month, offering brand development help to new nonprofits and community organizations who couldn't afford professional rates. Marcus joined me in this effort, and watching him light up while helping a youth arts program develop their visual identity reminded me why I'd chosen this field in the first place. Gerald's health declined that winter, not dramatically but noticeably. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, spent more afternoons napping in his recliner than working in his garden. I started visiting him twice a week instead of just Sundays, bringing groceries and cooking meals we'd share while watching old movies or sorting through more photo albums. He'd begun a project of documenting family history, writing down stories about my father's childhood, about his own parents who'd immigrated from Ireland with nothing but determination and faith in the future. "Someone needs to remember," he'd say, his handwriting growing shakier with each page. "Stories die when nobody passes them along." We talked about my mother sometimes, carefully, both of us trying to make sense of how someone could love their child and still harm them so profoundly. Gerald believed she'd been damaged by her own upbringing, raised by parents who measured worth in achievement and appearance, who taught her that love was conditional on meeting certain standards. Hurt people," he said one evening, his voice sad. "That doesn't excuse what she did to you, but maybe it explains it a little. She never learned that real love means wanting good things for someone even when it costs you something, even when they don't perform or produce or make you look good." I asked if he thought my mother could change, if the settlement and consequences might shock her into genuine transformation. Gerald was quiet for a long time before answering. "Change is possible," he said carefully. "But it requires humility and hard work and willingness to sit with your own ugliness without making excuses. Some people have that capacity and some don't. Your mother, I honestly don't know. But here's what I do know. Whether or not she changes isn't your responsibility. You've done what you needed to do to protect yourself and claim what was yours. What she does with that information, how she chooses to live going forward, that's on her. Your job now is to build the life your father dreamed for you, not to fix the person who tried to take it away." Brandon reached out occasionally through text messages, never asking for anything, just sending updates about his life. He'd sold 2 of his development properties to pay back his portion of the settlement, had downsized his apartment, was working with a therapist to understand his participation in family dysfunction. His messages were tentative, respectful of boundaries, acknowledging he had no right to expect sisterhood to resume just because he'd apologized. I appreciated that restraint, the recognition that trust had to be rebuilt slowly through consistent action rather than demanded as an entitlement of shared genetics. We met for coffee again in February on a day when unexpected sunshine broke through Portland's usual winter gray. Brandon looked healthier than he had at our last meeting, less burdened, as if shedding the artificial success built on stolen money had freed something in him. He told me about a smaller development project he was working on, something focused on affordable housing rather than luxury condos, funded entirely through legitimate loans he'd qualified for based on his actual experience and credit. "It's harder this way," he admitted. "The margins are smaller, the timeline is longer, I can't just throw money at problems. But it feels clean, you know? Like I'm finally building something I actually earned." I shared updates about my business growth, about the Cannon Beach house transformation, about feeling for the first time in my adult life like I wasn't constantly bracing for the next disaster. We talked carefully around the subject of our mother, neither of us quite ready to dissect that relationship thoroughly but both acknowledging its complexity. "She calls me every few days," Brandon said. "Wants to have family dinners, tries to recreate this image of us as a normal, close family. But I don't know how to do that when we've never actually been those things. She's acting like if we just go through the motions everything will reset, but that's not how it works. I recognize that impulse in my mother, the desire to skip over accountability and consequences straight to restoration of her preferred narrative. You don't owe her performance of family, I said quietly. If you want a relationship with her, it should be based on what's actually real, not on pretending the past didn't happen. Brandon nodded slowly, processing that permission to be honest rather than dutiful. We talked about the possibility of family therapy, professional mediation that might create space for real communication if our mother was willing. Neither of us felt optimistic about her openness to that process, but we agreed it was worth suggesting as a condition for moving forward. Spring arrived with its characteristic northwest tentative beauty, cherry blossoms blooming and rain softening into mist. I'd been living in Portland for a decade but felt like I was seeing the city freshly, no longer filtered through the lens of constant financial anxiety and family dysfunction. Kayla and I took long walks along the waterfront, planning a summer road trip down the California coast, making lists of galleries to visit and beaches to explore. She'd been offered a promotion at her tech company but was considering turning it down to pursue photography more seriously, and I found myself encouraging her toward the creative risk the way I wished someone had encouraged me years earlier. The design clinic I'd started grew beyond monthly sessions into a more formal program. We partnered with a local business incubator to offer branding workshops, portfolio reviews, and mentorship for emerging designers and artists. Marcus took the lead on curriculum development while I focused on recruiting volunteer professionals willing to donate their expertise. Watching the program take shape, seeing young creatives get support and guidance I desperately needed when starting out, filled something in me that had nothing to do with personal success and everything to do with building the kind of community that sustained rather than exploited its members. Gerald's health took a sudden turn in April, a fall that resulted in a broken hip and hospitalization. I spent days at the medical center, navigating conversations with doctors and coordinating care, becoming his primary advocate in ways that reversed our earlier dynamic when he'd been advocating for me. He was lucid and stubborn, arguing with nurses about medication schedules and insisting he'd be back on his feet within weeks despite medical evidence suggesting a longer recovery. I brought him books and podcasts, helped him video call with old friends from his architecture firm, smuggled in decent coffee to replace the hospital's terrible brew. One afternoon when he was particularly frustrated with his immobility, I pulled up photos on my phone showing the latest updates to the Cannon Beach house. He scrolled through images of the transformed space, the art studio bathed in natural light, the community table set for a dinner party I'd hosted the previous weekend, the view of the ocean through walls of windows. His eyes got wet as he handed back my phone. "Your dad and I used to talk about building something like that," he said softly. "A place where family could gather, where kids could run around, where there was always room for one more person at the table. He never got to make it happen, but you did. You made it real." The conversation turned to legacy and inheritance, not the financial kind we'd spent months litigating but the deeper inheritance of values and vision. Gerald talked about his own father, a carpenter who'd taught him that good work mattered more than fast work, that building things to last required patience and attention to detail. That philosophy had shaped Gerald's architecture career, his approach to relationships, his insistence on fighting for what was right even when it took years. "I'm passing that to you," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Not just money or property, but the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, that justice delayed isn't the same as justice denied, that family is built through showing up consistently even when it's hard." He came home from the hospital in May with a physical therapist visiting 3 times a week and a stubborn determination to regain his independence. I moved into his guest room temporarily, helping with daily tasks while he healed, cooking meals and managing medications and providing company during the long hours of rehabilitation exercises. We fell into an easy rhythm, mornings spent working side by side at his kitchen table, me on design projects while he wrote more family history and answered correspondence from former colleagues. Afternoons were for therapy and rest, evenings for simple dinners and old television shows we discovered we both enjoyed. Brandon visited once during this period, bringing flowers and sitting awkwardly in Gerald's living room making small talk about weather and recovery timelines. Gerald was gracious but direct, thanking Brandon for coming but also making clear that repairing relationships required more than occasional visits, it required sustained effort and genuine change over time. After Brandon left, Gerald turned to me and said, "He's trying. I can see that. But trying isn't the same as succeeding, and forgiveness isn't the same as trust. You get to decide what kind of relationship, if any, feels safe and authentic for you. Don't let anyone rush you into reconciliation before you're ready." My mother sent cards and emails throughout this period, always carefully worded to avoid acknowledging specific wrongdoing while expressing general desire for family healing. She invited me to holiday gatherings I didn't attend, suggested coffee dates I declined, offered to help with Gerald's care in ways that felt more about her appearing dutiful than genuine concern for his welfare. I responded minimally, politely, maintaining boundaries that protected the peace I'd worked so hard to establish. Mr. Frost had advised me to keep all communication in case future legal issues arose, so I saved every message but didn't let them penetrate the emotional armor I'd built. Summer arrived with unprecedented heat, Portland temperatures climbing into triple digits for days at a time. The city wasn't built for this kind of weather, most homes lacking air conditioning, everyone fleeing to rivers and mountains seeking relief. I invited Gerald to stay at the Cannon Beach house where ocean breezes kept temperatures moderate, and we spent 2 weeks there together, his last real vacation as it turned out. We walked slowly along the beach in early mornings before the day heated up, collected shells and watched shorebirds, talked about everything and nothing. He told me more stories about my father, moments I'd never heard before, filling in gaps in my understanding of who my dad had been before he was my parent. One evening as we watched sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Gerald said something I'd carry forever. "Your father worried about you, you know. He saw how your mother favored Brandon, how she had different standards and expectations for each of you. He tried to balance that, to make sure you knew you were loved and valued for who you were, not what you produced or achieved. When he was setting up the trust, he was very specific about his wishes. He said to me, 'Make sure Victoria gets her fair share no matter what. She's going to need it because she sees the world differently than most people, and different perspectives always struggle in systems built for conformity.'" Those words unlocked something I'd been holding onto without realizing it, a fear that maybe my mother had been right, maybe I was impractical and irresponsible and unsuited for the life my father had tried to build for me. But hearing that he'd understood my difference not as deficit but as valuable perspective, that he'd tried to protect my future precisely because I saw things differently, released years of internalized shame and doubt. I cried there on the deck watching the sun disappear into the Pacific, and Gerald just sat with me, his weathered hand on my shoulder, bearing witness to grief that was also relief. We returned to Portland in late July, Gerald noticeably weaker but insisting he was fine, just tired from the heat and travel. His physical therapist noted concerning changes in his mobility and coordination, recommended additional medical evaluation. The tests revealed what we'd both suspected but hadn't wanted to name out loud: his heart was failing, years of strain finally catching up with him despite medication and monitoring. The doctors talked about options, interventions, quality of life considerations. Gerald listened carefully, then made his choice clearly. No heroic measures, no prolonged suffering, just comfort and dignity and time to say goodbyes. He lasted until mid-September, autumn arriving with its characteristic northwest drama of sudden storms and falling leaves. I was with him at the end, holding his hand in the hospice room while rain drummed against windows, his breathing growing slower and more labored until it simply stopped. The hospice nurse checked his pulse, noted the time, said gentle words about peaceful passing and how lucky he was to have family present. I sat there with his cooling hand in mine, feeling the weight of loss but also gratitude for these last months we'd shared, for his unwavering support, for the example he'd set of how to fight for justice while maintaining compassion. The funeral was small, attended by Gerald's former colleagues, neighbors, and friends from his long life, people who told stories about his integrity, his generosity, his quiet strength that had touched so many lives. Brandon came, sitting in the back and leaving quickly after the service. My mother sent flowers with a card expressing condolences but didn't attend, respecting boundaries or avoiding discomfort, I couldn't tell which. Kayla stood beside me through the entire day, solid and present, anchoring me when grief threatened to wash me away completely. Gerald's will named me as executor and primary beneficiary, a responsibility I'd known was coming but that still felt heavy with significance. His estate wasn't large by some standards but was substantial enough to require careful management, property, and investments and personal belongings that needed distributing according to his wishes. He'd left specific items to former colleagues, donations to architecture schools and veterans organizations, and the bulk of his assets to me, with one significant stipulation. I was to establish a foundation supporting young people who'd been marginalized or exploited by their families, providing resources for legal advocacy, financial education, and therapeutic support. The Gerald Hayes Foundation for Family Justice became my primary focus that fall and winter, working with attorneys and nonprofit consultants to structure it properly, establish clear mission and values, build sustainable funding mechanisms. We launched publicly in March with a simple website and application process, not sure what response to expect. Within the first month we received over 300 requests for assistance from people across the country who'd experienced financial exploitation, inheritance theft, guardianship abuse, various forms of family harm that the legal system often failed to address adequately. The foundation work transformed my understanding of what had happened to me, placing my personal experience within a much larger pattern of family exploitation that spanned class, race, geography, and circumstance. I read applications from elderly parents whose children had drained their retirement accounts, from adult children cut out of inheritances by manipulative step-parents, from siblings who discovered years of financial theft after a parent's death. Each story carried its own particular details, but the underlying dynamics were heartbreakingly familiar. People in positions of trust using that access to enrich themselves while marginalizing those with less power or information. We funded legal representation for cases with strong documentation but insufficient resources to pursue justice. We provided financial counseling for people trying to rebuild after exploitation. We connected survivors with therapists who understood family trauma and the particular pain of betrayal by people who were supposed to protect and nurture. The work was emotionally demanding, requiring me to sit with other people's pain while maintaining enough professional distance to be effective rather than overwhelmed. But it also felt deeply meaningful, like transforming my own suffering into something that could prevent or heal suffering for others. Marcus took on more responsibility with the design business as I devoted increasing time to foundation work, proving himself capable of managing client relationships and leading projects with minimal oversight. We hired another designer, a woman named Jasmine, who brought expertise in accessible design and user experience, expanding our services into digital accessibility consulting for organizations serving disabled communities. The business continued growing, but I no longer measured success purely by revenue or client prestige. What mattered more was whether our work helped organizations do good things in the world, whether we operated ethically and sustainably, whether we created workplace culture that valued people over profit maximization. Brandon and I settled into something resembling sibling relationship, not what we'd had as children and not the toxic dynamic of our 20s, but something new built on honesty and appropriate boundaries. We met monthly for breakfast at a diner halfway between our neighborhoods, catching up on work and life without pretending our history hadn't happened or that everything was magically healed. He'd fully paid his settlement obligations ahead of schedule, working extra hours and taking on smaller projects to generate the necessary funds. His business had stabilized at a more modest scale, focused on community development projects that prioritized affordability and sustainability over maximum returns. He talked about his therapy work with surprising openness, sharing insights about family systems and enabling behaviors, how he'd learned to recognize when he was falling into old patterns of people-pleasing or conflict avoidance. I shared less about my own therapeutic journey, still maintaining protective privacy around my emotional processing, but I appreciated his willingness to be vulnerable without expecting reciprocal disclosure. We talked sometimes about our mother, comparing notes on her attempts to rebuild relationship with each of us, trying to discern whether any genuine change was happening beneath her continued focus on appearances and reputation management. My mother had moved to a smaller condo after selling the Lakewood Heights house, downsizing in ways that suggested either financial necessity or lifestyle choice. I couldn't determine which. She'd stopped reaching out as frequently after I declined her repeated invitations, finally seeming to accept that reconciliation would happen on my timeline if it happened at all. Brandon reported that she attended therapy sessions with him occasionally when he requested it, that she'd acknowledged some specific harms in those mediated conversations, but that she still struggled to sit with accountability without immediately moving to self-justification or requests for forgiveness that felt premature. I wasn't ready to engage with her directly, not yet, maybe not ever. The foundation work kept showing me new examples of how family harm compounded over time when left unaddressed, how patterns pass through generations unless someone had the courage to interrupt them. My mother's own childhood had been difficult in ways she'd hinted at but never fully explained, raised by parents who measured worth in achievement and provided affection conditionally based on performance. That context didn't excuse her choices, but it did help me understand them as part of a larger cycle rather than unique personal failing. The Cannon Beach house became exactly what I'd imagined when transforming it, a gathering place for chosen family and creative community. I hosted monthly dinners bringing together artists, activists, foundation staff, old friends, and new acquaintances who shared values around justice and creativity and authentic connection. Kayla became co-host of these gatherings after officially leaving her tech job to pursue photography full-time, her images capturing Portland's margins and overlooked beauty gaining recognition in local galleries and online platforms. We talked about maybe living together permanently, buying a place in the city we could share while keeping the beach house as retreat space. Marcus met someone at one of our dinners, a nonprofit director named David who ran an organization supporting LGBTQ youth experiencing family rejection. Their connection was immediate and beautiful to witness, two people finding each other through shared commitment to making the world slightly better despite its brokenness. I watched their relationship develop with something that felt like parental pride even though we were peers in age, happiness for Marcus finding the kind of acceptance and celebration he deserved. He brought David to the foundation office occasionally, and their collaborative brainstorming about intersection between family justice and queer youth advocacy spawned new program ideas we began developing. The foundation's second year brought expanded funding from philanthropic partners who recognized the critical gap we were filling. We hired additional staff, opened a small office in downtown Portland, began developing educational resources for people trying to navigate family financial conflicts before they escalated to litigation. We partnered with law schools to create clinical programs where students could gain experience with family exploitation cases under supervising attorneys, increasing access to representation while training the next generation of advocates. The work grew beyond anything I'd imagined when Gerald first suggested establishing the foundation, taking on momentum and life of its own. I thought about my father often during this period, wondered what he'd make of how his death and the theft that followed had ultimately generated something positive and protective for strangers facing similar harm. There was no way to know if he'd approve of my choices, if he'd be proud of the business I'd built and the foundation bearing his father's name. But I felt his presence sometimes in quiet moments, a sense of being seen and supported that had nothing to do with supernatural beliefs and everything to do with carrying forward values he'd tried to instill. Building things that mattered, creating community, fighting for justice even when it cost something, those were the inheritances that lasted longer than money or property. The third anniversary of that disastrous lunch at the Riverside Bistro arrived in October, falling on a Sunday much like the original day. I spent the morning at Gerald's grave, tidying the site and leaving fresh flowers, updating him on foundation progress and family dynamics as if he could hear. Then I drove to the Cannon Beach house where I'd invited a small group for dinner, Kayla and her partner, Marcus and David, a few foundation staff members who'd become genuine friends. We cooked together in the big kitchen, laughing and telling stories, the house warm with the kind of belonging I'd once thought only blood could create. As we sat down to eat, I looked around the table at these people who'd shown up consistently, who celebrated my successes and supported me through struggles, who'd chosen to be family in the truest sense of active participation rather than passive obligation. I thought about the version of myself who'd sat in that restaurant 3 years earlier, absorbing cruelty and accepting it as normal, believing I had to tolerate mistreatment to maintain connection. That woman felt both impossibly distant and intimately familiar, someone I'd been and couldn't be anymore, someone I honored by living differently now. Brandon had asked to join us for this dinner, and after discussing with my therapist I'd agreed. He arrived bearing wine and obvious nervousness, greeted warmly by people who knew our history but were willing to welcome him based on present behavior rather than past harm. He fit into the group more easily than I'd expected, his own journey through accountability making him able to engage authentically rather than performing the polished persona he'd hidden behind for years. Watching him laugh genuinely at one of Marcus's terrible jokes, seeing him listen with real interest as Kayla described her latest photography project, I felt something soften that had been rigid with protective anger. After dinner while others cleaned up, Brandon and I walked down to the beach, picking our way carefully over rocks in the dimming light. The ocean was rough, waves crashing with late autumn ferocity, spray salting the air we breathed. We stood watching the turbulent water for a long time before Brandon spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, his words nearly lost in the wind. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness or if that's even the right framework for what happened between us. But I want you to know that I see you now, really see you, in ways I didn't before. The work you're doing with the foundation, the business you've built, this life you've created, it's remarkable. You're remarkable. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to recognize that." I didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle while watching waves reorganize themselves endlessly against the shore. "I'm not sure about forgiveness either," I finally said. "But I think I've moved past needing it, past needing anything from you beyond basic respect and honesty. You're doing your work, I'm doing mine. Maybe that's enough." He nodded slowly, accepting the boundary while also seeming relieved by its clarity. We walked back to the house together, not quite comfortable but no longer hostile, two people who shared history and DNA trying to figure out what relationship was possible given everything that had happened. My mother remained absent from this gathering and from my life more broadly, her occasional emails growing less frequent over time until they mostly stopped. Brandon reported that she was doing better in some ways, had maintained therapy and was working on a memoir about family relationships and lessons learned through hardship. The idea of her writing about our story without my input or consent initially angered me, but my therapist helped me recognize I couldn't control her narrative choices, only my own. If she wanted to tell her version of events, that was her right. It didn't diminish or erase my truth, didn't require my participation or approval. Winter brought another wave of foundation applications as people filed taxes and discovered financial irregularities, as holidays forced contact with families that had been avoided throughout the year, as end-of-life planning revealed exploitation that had been carefully hidden. We expanded our volunteer attorney network, added support groups for people navigating complicated family dynamics, developed resources specifically for caregivers at risk of exploitation by the people they were caring for. Each program emerged from listening to what survivors actually needed rather than assuming we knew best, building services in response to expressed needs rather than theoretical frameworks. The design business continued thriving under Marcus and Jasmine's leadership, allowing me to step back into advisory role rather than daily operations. We brought in 2 more designers, both people of color who brought perspectives that had been missing from our predominantly white team, expanding our capacity to serve diverse communities authentically. The business felt like it had grown up, matured from scrappy startup into established firm with clear values and sustainable practices, no longer dependent on my constant presence to function well. That autonomy freed me to focus more on foundation work while knowing the business I'd built would continue contributing positive impact regardless of my direct involvement. Kayla and I bought a small craftsman house in the Alberta Arts District that spring, a place with good light for her photography and enough space for me to maintain a home office. We moved in during that brief perfect window of Portland spring when everything blooms simultaneously and the rain pauses long enough to appreciate the beauty. The house needed work, updating systems and refreshing surfaces worn by decades of previous occupants, but we tackled projects together on weekends, painting walls and refinishing floors, building the kind of home neither of us had experienced growing up. Our families had been complicated in different ways, hers marked by divorce and remarriage and competing loyalties, mine by exploitation and favoritism and systematic cruelty. Creating something stable and healthy together felt like healing for both of us. The 4th anniversary of my father's death arrived in June, a date I'd observed quietly each year with private grief and remembrance. This year felt different though, less heavy with loss and more peaceful with acceptance that he was gone and wouldn't return but that his influence continued shaping who I was becoming. I organized a memorial gathering at the Cannon Beach house, inviting people who'd known him and people who knew me, blending past and present in ways that honored his memory while celebrating the life I'd built. Brandon came and shared stories I'd never heard about our father's terrible jokes and patient teaching, humanizing the man who'd been frozen in my memory as idealized parent rather than complex real person. My mother sent flowers with a card that acknowledged the date and expressed love without attempting to insert herself into the gathering, a gesture that showed more awareness and respect than her previous communications. I appreciated the restraint, the recognition that some spaces weren't hers to occupy regardless of biological connection. Brandon mentioned that she was dating someone new, a retired teacher who apparently had no tolerance for manipulation or self-pity, someone whose presence seemed to encourage more authentic behavior. I felt ambivalent about this information, neither happy nor upset, just aware that her life was continuing and changing in ways that didn't directly involve me. The foundation received an award that fall from a national organization focused on elder justice, recognition for innovative approaches to preventing and addressing family financial exploitation. I accepted the award on behalf of Gerald and my father, explaining how personal experience of harm had motivated the work, how justice delayed had ultimately become justice expanded to benefit many others. The visibility from the award brought new funding opportunities and partnership inquiries, organizations interested in replicating our model in other regions, journalists wanting to write about family exploitation as systemic issue rather than individual failing. I did selected media interviews, carefully protecting my own privacy while sharing enough detail to illustrate the problem's scope and impact. Some stories mentioned my mother and brother by name despite my requests to keep them anonymous, resulting in brief social media attention and speculation that I found uncomfortable but manageable. My mother sent a terse email asking me to stop publicly embarrassing the family, then apologized hours later saying her therapist had pointed out that my speaking truth wasn't embarrassment, her actions had created the situation and she needed to accept natural consequences. That exchange felt like progress, evidence that sustained therapeutic work was shifting something fundamental in how she understood responsibility and accountability. Brandon's business pivoted toward affordable housing development became increasingly successful as cities recognized the need for diverse housing options beyond luxury and low-income extremes. He won contracts for several significant projects, proving that ethical business practices and modest profit margins could coexist with professional success and community benefit. He gave credit publicly to the foundation for teaching him about exploitation from the victim's perspective, how power dynamics in business relationships mirrored family patterns of marginalization and extraction. His willingness to speak openly about his own past wrongdoing and ongoing growth made him unexpectedly effective advocate for ethical business practices, someone whose journey from perpetrator to accountability resonated with other business owners struggling with similar issues. The design clinic expanded into a full-fledged creative mentorship program, partnering with schools and community centers to provide design education for young people who'd been told they weren't college material or that creative careers were impractical. We watched teenagers light up discovering they had visual communication skills, that their ability to imagine different possibilities was valuable, that art and design could be viable professional paths with the right support and guidance. Several program participants later joined our staff or started their own businesses, the mentorship paying forward in exactly the ways we'd hoped. I turned 35 that December, a birthday that felt significant in ways I couldn't fully articulate. 15 years since my father's death, a decade and a half of fumbling toward the life I was finally living. Kayla organized a surprise party at our house, filling rooms with people whose presence reflected the chosen family I'd assembled piece by piece, friends and colleagues and foundation clients who'd become friends, a community bound by shared values rather than obligation or proximity. Brandon came, bringing Vanessa who'd reached out to him months earlier asking if they could talk, both of them navigating what reconciliation might look like after everything that had fractured their marriage. My mother wasn't invited and didn't expect to be, that boundary remaining firm even as others had softened slightly. I wasn't punishing her with exclusion so much as protecting the peace I'd worked to build, recognizing that her presence would shift the emotional tenor in ways I wasn't willing to accommodate even on my own birthday. Maybe someday that would change. Maybe we'd find our way to some modified relationship that acknowledged both shared history and irreconcilable differences. Or maybe we wouldn't, maybe this distance would become permanent, two people who'd once been intimately connected now living separate lives that barely intersected. Both outcomes felt acceptable, neither one requiring immediate resolution. The party wound down late with a core group remaining, sitting around our living room sharing stories and laughter that came easily after hours of food and wine and connection. Kayla proposed a toast to chosen family, to people who stayed when things got hard, to the radical act of building community based on love and commitment rather than default assumptions of belonging. We raised glasses to that beautiful messy project of creating family intentionally, to all the ways we showed up for each other, to futures we'd build together through continued presence and care. I looked around the room at faces illuminated by candlelight and string lights Kayla had hung earlier, feeling something close to contentment. Not the absence of struggle but the presence of support that made struggle bearable. Late that night after everyone left and Kayla was already asleep, I sat at the kitchen table sorting through mail that had accumulated during party preparations. Among bills and advertisements was a letter addressed in shaky handwriting I didn't recognize, a California postmark and return address from a hospice facility. I opened it carefully, unfolding lined notebook paper covered in cramped script. The letter was from a woman named Dorothy who'd read about the foundation in a magazine article, who'd been financially exploited by her own children and had felt too ashamed to seek help until seeing that others had experienced similar betrayal. She wrote that the foundation had funded legal representation that helped her recover enough assets to afford decent end-of-life care, that she was dying peacefully now because someone had believed her story and fought for her dignity when her own children wouldn't. The letter thanked me specifically for having the courage to speak publicly about family harm, for creating resources that helped people like her who'd been told by society that family problems should remain private, that airing grievances was disloyal or vindictive. She wrote that surviving exploitation by people who were supposed to love and protect you required different kind of strength than surviving harm by strangers, that the foundation recognized and honored that particular pain in ways few other organizations did. She ended by saying she was praying for me if I believed in that sort of thing, and if I didn't, she was sending good thoughts into the universe on my behalf, gratitude for how my willingness to transform personal suffering into collective healing had changed the end of her life for the better. I sat holding that letter for a long time, tears streaming down my face, understanding in a new way why all the pain and confrontation and legal battles and family fracture had been necessary and worthwhile. Not just for my own healing and justice, though those mattered tremendously, but for Dorothy and the hundreds of others the foundation had served, for all the people still trapped in exploitation who might find their way to us and discover they weren't alone, that escape and restoration were possible with support and resources. The work was bigger than my individual story, connected to generations of family harm that only got addressed when someone broke the silence and demanded accountability. I saved Dorothy's letter in the foundation files, adding it to the collection of testimonials that reminded staff why we did this difficult work, why sitting with other people's trauma and fighting complicated legal battles was worth the emotional toll. Her letter joined others from grateful clients, from attorneys who'd found renewed purpose working on our cases, from family members who'd been inspired to examine their own dynamics more honestly after learning about exploitation patterns. Together those letters created narrative of transformation, evidence that speaking truth about harm could catalyze healing not just for individuals but for entire family systems willing to examine themselves honestly. The Foundation's 5-year plan included expanding to multiple states, developing training programs for social workers and healthcare providers who often witnessed exploitation but lacked tools to intervene effectively, creating legislative advocacy network to push for stronger legal protections against family financial abuse. The vision Gerald and I had sketched in his kitchen during those early planning conversations was growing beyond what we'd imagined possible, touching more lives and catalyzing more systemic change than I'd dared hope. His legacy and my father's was being written through this work, their values made tangible through services that protected and empowered people their own families had failed. Spring returned with its reliable beauty, Portland shaking off winter gray and exploding into bloom that felt especially vibrant after months of rain and darkness. I spent more time at the Cannon Beach house as the foundation stabilized with strong staff leadership, needing space and quiet to process everything that had happened across these transformative years. Walking the beach alone in early mornings, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, sitting in that restaurant absorbing cruelty as if it were love, believing I had to accept whatever family offered because blood created obligation that transcended harm. That version of myself felt like a stranger now, someone I recognized but couldn't fully access anymore, separated by too much growth and change and hard-won understanding. I thought about my mother sometimes with something approaching compassion, recognizing how her own wounds had shaped her capacity to wound others, how trauma unaddressed rippled through generations leaving damage that looked intentional but was often more accurately described as unconscious reenactment of old patterns. That understanding didn't erase what she'd done or obligate me to relationship I didn't want, but it softened my anger into something more like sadness for all the ways people hurt each other while claiming love as justification. Maybe she'd continue doing her own work, maybe she'd eventually arrive at genuine accountability rather than performative apology. Maybe we'd find our way to some form of connection that honored both our shared past and our irreconcilable differences. Or maybe we wouldn't, maybe this distance would be permanent. Either outcome was acceptable because my well-being and healing no longer depended on her choices or her transformation. Brandon and I maintained our monthly breakfasts, that rhythm becoming reliable anchor point in lives that were otherwise quite separate. We'd found our way to sibling relationship that worked for who we actually were rather than who we'd been expected to be, built on honesty and appropriate boundaries rather than assumed intimacy or forced closeness. Some months we talked deeply about family dynamics and personal growth, other months we stuck to surface topics like work and weather and local news. Both types of conversation felt valuable, evidence that relationship could be flexible and responsive rather than rigidly defined by either complete enmeshment or total estrangement. The life I'd built bore little resemblance to what I'd imagined during those struggling years when I believed success meant proving my mother wrong about me, demonstrating that I could achieve conventional markers of accomplishment despite her predictions of failure. Real success turned out to be something quieter and deeper, having autonomy to make choices aligned with my values, surrounding myself with people who celebrated rather than diminished me, doing work that contributed to collective well-being rather than just individual advancement, feeling at home in my own life rather than constantly performing for an audience that would never be satisfied. Those things couldn't be photographed or posted or used to impress people at cocktail parties, but they nourished me in ways external validation never had. 5 years after that catastrophic lunch that had catalyzed everything, I organized another gathering at the Riverside Bistro, deliberately returning to the site where public humiliation had sparked private revolution. This time the table was filled with Foundation board members, major donors, staff, and volunteers gathering to celebrate 5 years of operation and plan for the next phase of growth. We sat in the same corner where my mother had once said she wished I'd never existed, and I felt the ghost of that moment overlaid on present reality, aware of how radically everything had shifted. The laughter at this table was genuine rather than cruel, the conversation focused on collective mission rather than individual status, the relationships built on mutual respect rather than exploitation and enabling. I stood to offer a toast halfway through the meal, acknowledging everyone's contributions while also telling the story of what had happened in this space years earlier, how personal devastation had ultimately generated organizational mission. Some people at the table knew the full story, others were hearing it for the first time, but everyone understood that transformation often emerged from crisis, that the most meaningful work frequently grew from the soil of personal suffering. I raised my glass to second chances and chosen family, to the courage required to demand justice even when it fractured everything familiar, to the possibility that pain could be transmuted into purpose without being erased or minimized. The evening ended with plans for the Foundation's future, ambitious goals that felt achievable with the infrastructure and support we'd built. Driving home through Portland streets I'd navigated for over a decade, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here, for everyone who'd supported me along the way, for my own stubborn refusal to accept mistreatment as the price of belonging. The envelope I'd placed on that table 5 years ago had contained a letter from Gerald exposing my mother's theft, but it had also contained something less tangible, the beginning of my voice, my willingness to finally speak truth regardless of consequences, my understanding that real family was built through sustained care rather than biological accident. My father had wanted security and opportunity for me, had tried to provide that through financial inheritance that got stolen. But the deeper inheritance he'd left, the values and vision that shaped who I was becoming, those couldn't be taken by anyone. They lived in how I moved through the world, how I treated people, what I considered worth fighting for, the legacy I was building through work that mattered and relationships that nourished rather than depleted. That inheritance was mine completely, protected not by legal documents but by daily choices to live according to principles my father had modeled, principles Gerald had reinforced, principles I was now passing forward to others through Foundation work and personal example. The city lights blurred as tears filled my eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming recognition of how far I'd traveled from that woman sitting alone with cold pizza, how much had changed and grown and healed. I was Victoria Hayes, daughter of a man who'd believed I was worthy of protection and support, granddaughter of a man who'd fought for justice when others stayed silent, friend and colleague and mentor to people building community based on mutual care. I was designer, Foundation director, chosen family member, survivor who'd refused to stay silent about harm. I was all these things and more, constantly evolving, never finished, always learning how to be more fully myself. And that was enough, more than enough, it was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.